Hey guys, so now we are moving into standard SS8H6 strand B. And this strand just talks about the different plans that were made to rebuild the nation. And it reads, explain the key features of the Lincoln, the Johnson, and the Congressional Reconstruction plans. So, Reconstruction was a time of really major change happening in Georgia. After the Civil War, the South needed to rebuild because there was so much destruction, both in the mines and physically in the state of Georgia. So this is a relatively short period of time between 1865 and 1872. A lot of Georgia was destroyed by Sherman during his march to the sea, and over 40,000 Georgians had been killed or wounded in the Civil War. The ones that remained alive after the Civil War many of them had lost large portions of land during this. So we're going to talk about some plans that were made to reconstruct the United States during this time. And we're going to start out by talking about Lincoln's Reconstruction plan. So Lincoln had a plan that he really wanted to focus on bringing the country back together after the war was over. That was his main goal during this. And this became known as the Lincoln Reconstruction plan. After the war was beginning to slow down and it looked like the end would be coming near, Lincoln came up with a plan that was known as the 10% plan. And part of this plan, let's say, had three main points, okay? First of all, he's going to pardon and restore the people who fought, except for high-ranking officials. Second, and this is where the plan gets its name, is that 10% of the voters had to pledge allegiance to the U.S., and 10% of the voters in each state had to approve this plan. Also, the states had to agree to the 13th Amendment, and so slavery would no longer exist in any state across the nation. Unfortunately, though, Lincoln never got to carry out this plan because he was assassinated before he was able to enforce his Reconstruction plan. President Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, were watching a play in Ford's Theater on April 14th of 1865, and this was just 5 days after the South surrendered. John Wilkes Booth, an actor who had backstage access in Ford's Theater, was able to get close enough to President Lincoln on that day to shoot him in the back of the head from just a few feet away. President Lincoln was pronounced dead the following morning. So, Vice President Andrew Johnson becomes the new president, and he vows to continue Lincoln's plan. He wanted to honor Lincoln, and he wanted to make sure that the three things he wanted were part of Johnson's Reconstruction plan as well. He also wanted to make sure that the southern states accepted the 13th Amendment if they wanted to be admitted back into the Union. So here is a photograph of Andrew Johnson, and he became the nation's 17th president. So Georgia knew that Lincoln's Reconstruction plan was going to be a fairly easy policy. And as a result, they wanted to make sure that everyone was on board. And so they held a constitutional convention in 1866 and passed the 13th Amendment. So due to the passage of the 13th Amendment, Georgia was readmitted into the Union in December of 1865. And this brings us into Johnson's Reconstruction plan. So basically, Johnson's Reconstruction plan is Lincoln's Reconstruction plan. However, because Johnson is from the South, he is even more lenient on southern states than Lincoln is. He does want to make sure that the southern states accept the 13th Amendment if they want to be admitted back into the Union. However, a group of Republicans known as radical Republicans, believed that Lincoln's plan was way too easy on the South. And the radical Republicans wanted to punish the South for causing the Civil War. And this is Thaddeus Stevens, an example of a radical Republican who pushed the passage of the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery and wanted to punish the South for the Civil War. In Georgia, the people who elected 2 former Confederate officials to the U.S., the first former Confederate vice president was Alexander Stephens, and a senator was named Herschel Johnson. Here is Alexander Stephens, and here is Herschel Johnson. And so when dealing with Johnson's Reconstruction plan, the radical Republicans grew really, really angry because high-ranking officials in Congress were former CSA officials. So they refused to allow them to take their seats and accused President Johnson of abusing his power as president. So Johnson wanted the Union back together, just like the goal of Lincoln, and he actually went as far as to pardon the former Confederates, but he did not offer pardons to former officers or rich landowners. The Republicans, however, believed that Johnson was taking advantage of his power, and so they brought in impeachment charges against him. And these are just formal charges that say, we don't think you're doing a good job, or we think you're doing something wrong. However, Johnson just barely escaped removal from office. The final vote was 19-18. And while Johnson was allowed to stay in office, he really had no power during this time. And this brings us to the Congressional Reconstruction Plan. The South at this time began to pass these things called black codes. And these were laws that banned free men from doing things that they had already been allowed to do, such as voting, testifying against whites in court, or serving as jurors in trials. And these black codes resulted in further poor treatment of freed slaves, and it really set the stage for the Jim Crow laws and things that we're going to talk about when we get into the civil rights movement. So Congress at this time introduced the 14th Amendment, and this declares that African Americans are now citizens of the United States, and as a result, they must be given the same rights as all other U.S. citizens. So Southern states are required to pass the 14th Amendment to be readmitted into the Union. And if they refuse, they're stripped of their statehood and they are no longer allowed to be a part of the United States. And if they were stripped of their statehood, they would be run by something called a military governor, which is sent by the United States to run each individual state. So, of course, Georgia refuses at the beginning to ratify the 14th Amendment, and as a result, they are taken over by a military governor, and the 2 military governors that ran Georgia were John Pope and George Meade. John Pope was the first military governor to be in charge of Georgia. Here is a photograph of John Pope and George Meade. And so during this time, Georgia held another constitutional convention. And this time it was held in Atlanta and not the capital of Milledgeville. So remember our Selma. Milledgeville was the capital before Atlanta. But it was held in Atlanta because Atlanta was a little more accepting of the things that they wanted to take place at the Constitutional Convention. Milledgeville refused to accommodate Republicans or black delegates. Atlanta did not. And so as a result, it was held in Atlanta. Atlanta was chosen, again, because it accepted elected Republican delegates and it allowed 37 African American delegates. So during this time, Georgia created a new constitution, and in this new constitution, it created a policy for black voting rights. It allowed new public schools, and it officially moved the capital to Atlanta. After this convention, this constitutional convention was held, Republican Rufus Bullock was elected as governor, and the Republicans controlled the Georgia General Assembly. This is Rufus Bullock, and he was the last Republican governor of Georgia until Sonny Perdue in 2002. So there was a long string of Democrat governors in Georgia. So the military did remain in Georgia, and again, Georgia refuses to pass the 15th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. Here is a political cartoon that I'm sure we will talk about in class. So in 1870, Georgia is finally readmitted into the Union, and as a result of being readmitted into the Union, it had to reinstate Republican and black legislators. It also had to vote for the passage of the 15th Amendment. In 1872, Southern Democrats called Redeemers are voted back into office, and as a result, the Democrats reassumed control of the governorship and the Georgia General Assembly.